They called me useless, said my years in the Air Force were a waste. But the day I revealed the truth, they wished they had never underestimated me. I still remember that night like it happened yesterday. I had just returned from a 12-hour shift at the Air Force Base, exhausted, body aching, and mind heavy with memories of missions I'd carried out with precision, risking my life countless times for my country. I thought my family would greet me with pride, maybe even a warm smile. Instead, I was met with laughter, mockery, disbelief. My own son, the boy I had changed diapers for, who I had taught the value of discipline, respect, and honor, stared at me across the dinner table with a smirk. "Why do you even bother, Dad? All that time in the Air Force? And what do you have to show for it?" I felt my chest tighten, not from exhaustion, but from betrayal. How could the person I loved most reduce my decades of sacrifice to a joke? But that wasn't all. Over the next few days, I discovered something far worse. He had been leaking confidential information from my old service records to his friends, boasting about it like it was some twisted game. My son, my own flesh and blood, had betrayed everything I stood for. I wanted to scream. I wanted to confront him, but I knew anger alone wouldn't teach him the lesson he desperately needed. This was more than pride. It was about respect, honor, and the legacy of a lifetime spent serving my country. That night, I made a decision, a plan, a way to show him the consequences of underestimating a man who had fought for his nation with courage and who had sacrificed far more than he could ever understand. Little did he know, the game had just begun. The next morning, I woke up with a burning resolve. I could no longer ignore the betrayal, nor could I let it slide. My son had crossed a line that went beyond disrespect. He had endangered the trust I had built throughout my years in the Air Force. But I knew revenge wouldn't come from anger or confrontation. It would come from strategy, patience, and showing him the true value of discipline and honor. I started by revisiting my old files, my mission records, and the certificates that documented decades of service. Hidden in these records were not just memories of victories and medals, but also secrets, operational tactics, training methodologies, and even small tricks of the trade that could give someone a huge advantage if used correctly. I had kept these details secure for years, knowing one day they might be the key to teaching a lesson that no amount of words could convey. Over the next few days, I watched my son carefully. He thought he was clever, sharing snippets of my history with friends, laughing at how he knew all the secrets of an old Air Force veteran. He didn't realize that every move he made was being tracked, documented, and remembered. Every boastful word, every careless laugh became part of the evidence I would later use. I also enlisted help, not from strangers, but from trusted old comrades, men and women who had served alongside me, who respected the sacrifices we had all made. They understood the importance of loyalty and honor, and they agreed to assist me in a plan that would leave my son shocked, humbled, and forced to recognize the weight of what he had done. The night arrived. I watched from a distance as he strutted into the room, confident and arrogant. He didn't realize that each of the guests present had first-hand knowledge of my achievements, my strategies, and my ability to handle situations with precision. Within moments, the laughter he expected from peers turned into a tense, silent room where every eye was on him, analyzing, judging, and waiting. And then I stepped forward, calm, composed. My son's smirk faltered when he realized the room was not his playground, it was my arena. Slowly, I began recounting stories from my Air Force days, each one revealing not just my courage and sacrifices, but also my ability to anticipate, adapt,
and overcome challenges that even seasoned officers would respect. By the end of the evening, my son's confidence was shattered. He realized that betraying me, mocking my service, and leaking information wasn't clever. It was foolish, and the lesson had only just begun.
But I wasn't done. Using my old Air Force contacts, I arranged for him to face a simulated mission, a high-stakes challenge disguised as a professional opportunity. He was confident, as always, believing he could navigate it effortlessly. But the task had layers, complications, and pitfalls only someone trained with real experience could anticipate. Slowly, his frustration grew, turning into fear and respect for the very skills he had mocked. As he struggled, I observed quietly from the sidelines. I didn't need to yell to confront him. The lesson was writing itself in real time. The arrogance of a son who betrayed his father was meeting the quiet, calculated strength of a man who had dedicated decades to discipline, strategy, and honor. By nightfall, my son was exhausted, humbled, and finally aware. Mocking, betraying, or underestimating someone with real experience carries consequences. And that, my friends, was only the beginning. By the time Chapter 4 begins, the tension had escalated to a level my son could no longer ignore. The sneers, the mocking comments about my Air Force service, and the betrayal of my trust had finally caught up to him. But the most powerful lesson wasn't in confrontation, it was in revelation. The next morning, I called him into the living room under the guise of a family meeting. His posture was stiff, guilt and uncertainty written across his face. Little did he know, I had planned an exercise that would change everything. I handed him a folder labeled Confidential Mission Briefing. It looked official, military grade, and utterly serious. Inside were instructions that he believed were tied to real contracts and operations. What he didn't realize was that I had embedded subtle, impossible-to-succeed details, a test of patience, intelligence, and humility. He spent hours attempting to follow the instructions, frustrated at every turn. Each failure wasn't just a mistake, it was a mirror reflecting his arrogance and betrayal back at him. And while he struggled, I calmly observed, knowing that this immersive experience would teach him more than any lecture ever could. Finally, I spoke. You see, all the shortcuts you've taken, all the betrayal, it's only ever punished when you fail to respect what's real. What you stole from me, the mockery, the disrespect, you learned none of the principles that earned me this life. And now you're experiencing the cost firsthand. The shock in his eyes was palpable. Humility washed over him slowly, painfully. This was more than just revenge. It was a revelation. My Air Force discipline taught me patience, strategy, and precision. I had used every skill I had acquired over decades, not to hurt him, but to ensure he understood the consequences of his actions in a way he would never forget. And just when he thought it was over, I introduced the final twist, a real opportunity for redemption that required true courage and integrity. But to earn it, he had to prove he had learned the lesson.
By now, my son had spent days wrestling with the mission briefing I had given him. Each failed attempt had chipped away at his pride, leaving him raw, anxious, and more self-aware than he had ever been. But I wasn't done. This chapter of his education had only just begun. I called him into the home office, the room where I had spent years planning and executing my Air Force operations. Everything from the maps on the walls to the old medals on the shelf reminded him of my service, my discipline, and the life he had so carelessly mocked. The weight of my accomplishments pressed down on him in a way he couldn't ignore. "You've struggled, and rightly so," I said, my tone calm but commanding. "Now it's time to show whether you've learned anything. You have a choice: redemption or ruin. One path requires honesty, respect, and courage. The other, well, you've seen what failure looks like." I handed him a sealed envelope. Inside were instructions to return one of my prized Air Force artifacts, something he had disrespected during his betrayal. But it wasn't just about returning it. He had to explain the significance, the sacrifice, and the history behind it. To do so, he had to face the truth of my service and the trust he had shattered. As he began, I watched closely. His hands shook, and his voice wavered as he recounted my missions, my hardships, and the lives I had touched. For the first time, he wasn't mocking or dismissive. He was absorbing, internalizing, and finally respecting what he had once taken for granted. The twist came when I revealed the last part of his test. The artifact he returned was part of a symbolic ceremony I had planned with my old Air Force unit, an opportunity for him to publicly make amends in front of people who had known my service firsthand. His embarrassment, fear, and eventual courage would teach him more than any punishment ever could. By the end of the day, my son had changed. He wasn't perfect, and he wouldn't forget the lessons learned, but the seeds of humility, respect, and understanding were firmly planted. I had given him a second chance, but only because he had proven he was ready to earn it. The morning sun hit the Air Force Base just right, casting long shadows over the hangars. Today wasn't about drills or ranks. It was about closure, redemption, and confronting the past. I called my son to the field, the same place where I had spent countless hours training, leading, and defending our nation. Every echoing footstep of mine reminded him of what he had mocked, disrespected, and even attempted to sell secrets. I handed him my old flight jacket, the one I had worn on missions that few knew the full story of. "Wear this," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Today, you represent more than yourself. You represent trust, honor, and the consequences of betrayal." His eyes widened. The weight of my service and his betrayal was tangible. He struggled to put the jacket on, as if accepting it meant accepting the lessons of the past decade. I watched him, my heart heavy yet hopeful. Today, he would finally understand sacrifice, duty, and the cost of disrespect. I led him to the small ceremony I had organized with my old Air Force comrades. The men and women who had fought, trained, and bled beside me now stood in solemn rows, their eyes fixed on him. It wasn't punishment, but accountability. I explained to them what happened, how my son had mocked, betrayed, and even attempted to sell secrets, but also how he had spent weeks proving himself through honesty, humility, and dedication. The twist, the moment that left everyone, including him, breathless, was what came next. I handed him a folded letter I had kept hidden in my personal effects for years. Inside was my most personal mission report, detailing sacrifices and covert operations that no one outside the military had ever seen. By entrusting it to him, I was not only testing his integrity, but offering him a chance at true redemption. Tears ran down his face as he read. I had no idea," he whispered, voice breaking. I was wrong. I'm so sorry, Dad." I nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder. Actions speak louder than words. Today, you made amends. Never forget what trust and honor truly mean. As we walked off the field together, my son transformed before my eyes, not just as my child, but as a man who understood loyalty, respect, and the weight of a legacy. The betrayal that once tore us apart had become the bridge that brought us back together. And in that moment, I knew some lessons are harsh, Some are shocking, but the right ones last a lifetime.